Entre 1942 y 43, los nazis desarrollaron una de las campañas de genocidio más espeluznantes de la historia.
The terror of the Third Reich was commanded by bloodthirsty and cruel men, but few like Franz Stangl. This man was not in charge of one, but of two of the most lethal camps in the occupied territory of Poland. One of these extermination centers was Sobibor, where the Nazi officer demonstrated his effectiveness in ending the life of anyone who was on the regime's blacklist. But later, it would be his turn to shine as a leader in Treblinka. This space was synonymous with mass murder, and up to 12,000 Jews died per day. His methods were so effective for the Nazi plan that they were taken as an example to be replicated in each of the fearsome camps. In this new video, we will learn about the life of Commander Franz Stangl, one of the most lethal characters of the Holocaust. We will discover how he killed his victims and what his fate was after the war, since he also spread terror in another corner of the planet. If you want to review some of the most atrocious crimes of the last century, then stay with us and let's go through this savage and bloody military history together.
Can you stand there and watch people being injected? Can you stand there and watch 150 people being gassed in a chamber?
He enjoyed murdering people in hard time. He was a passionate believer in Hitler's theories of race and the superiority of the Aryans.
Himmler, who was the head of the SS, personally selected Franz Stangl to supervise this place. He appointed him to that post because he knew that he could handle it. By the time they finished, they had murdered around 30,000 people.
Franz Paul Stangl was born on March 26, 1908, in the small Austrian town of Altmünster. He grew up in a devoutly Catholic family and completed his public school education in 1923. He was later accepted into the Austrian Federal Police Academy in Linz and underwent rigorous training for 2 years. In 1931, he became a member of the Nazi Party and welcomed the annexation of Germany by his country in March 1938. By then, Stangl was already a police officer and took just 2 months to join the feared SS, where he would later rise to the rank of captain or SS Hauptsturmführer. The Austrian began to build a career as a strongman of the Third Reich, always ready to comply with the orders of his superiors and the wishes of Adolf Hitler. He was a committed follower of the Nazi cause, and his performance in each assigned task was always more than satisfactory. Thus, he came to be recruited for the secret extermination program, known as Action T4 and covered under the term euthanasia. This was part of Germany's strategy for the systematic murder of mentally ill and disabled patients, interned in different institutions throughout the country. It was one of many radical measures that were aimed at restoring the racial integrity of the German nation. Its goal was to eliminate lives that the regime and its supporters considered not worth living. That is, people who, they believed, represented both a genetic and economic burden on German society and the state, due to their severe psychiatric, neurological, or physical disabilities. Franz Stangl served this initiative at the Hartheim and Bernburg centers, where he demonstrated great efficiency and earned consideration for Adolf Hitler's future plans. Although the euthanasia program began in 1939, about 2 years later the Nazis would shape the so-called final solution, under which they would systematically murder the Jews of Europe, and men like Stangl were needed to carry out this task.
And Stangl eventually takes part in the next new Nazi extermination program called Operation Reinhardt.
Operation Reinhardt was the code name for the mass murder of Polish Jews at death camps.
The purpose of a death camp is solely to kill.
Nazi Germany had built up a small amount of experience with concentration camps since the Nazi regime took power in 1933. The first camps were built at that time and were used for coercion, forced labor, and imprisonment, but not for mass murder. The camp system expanded dramatically with the Nazi-Soviet invasion of Poland at the start of World War II, and the new network of SS-built camps became increasingly cruel. Prisoners began to die by the tens of thousands from starvation and untreated disease, and later executions were carried out to inflict terror. But these were only the first steps of a sinister regime. In January 1942, during a secret meeting of German leaders chaired by Reinhard Heydrich, the head of the Reich Security Main Office, Operation Reinhard was drafted. This was the next link in Nazism's plans to expand the systematic murder of Jews throughout occupied Europe, and in this case, more precisely on Polish soil. Within months, 3 camps were built to efficiently kill thousands of people per day. These differed from Auschwitz and Majdanek because the latter initially operated as forced labor camps before becoming extermination centers. Meanwhile, the Operation Reinhard sites had no prisoners, and their goal was to industrialize the killing. Victims arrived, were killed, and their bodies were disposed of. Franz Stangl's new task would be to polish the gears of these perfectly organized massacres. His first destination was the Belzec camp, although there, he only studied the functioning and operations to understand the nature and reason for the existence of the extermination centers, which crowned a long history of lies and hopes that would only end with death.
El proceso al completo, desde el gueto hasta la cámara de gas, implicaba una serie de crueles engaños. Para empezar, los alemanes solicitaban dinero a los judíos del gueto para convencerles de los beneficios que obtendrían al realizar aquel viaje. De esta forma conseguían reunir a miles de hombres, mujeres y niños.
In the worst cases, victims believed they were going to labor camps and were packed into train carriages for days without food or water. However, what they found when they arrived at their destination was much worse. Stangl needed very little time to become familiar with this cruel job, and his disregard for the lives of the people he was to kill made him the perfect man for the job. The time had come for him to fulfill his most important role within the regime, and for this, he was appointed commander of the extermination camp at Sobibor. Located in a forest near the town of the same name, located in the current territory of the Polish province of Lublin. It was built in March 1942 and operated from May of that year until October 1943. Franz Stangl headed the team in charge of the site, accompanied by a staff of 30 other SS men and the assistance of between 90 and 120 Ukrainians, former prisoners of war trained by the Germans for their new assignments. From May to July 1942, the Nazis transported Jews to Sobibor from Poland, Germany, Austria, and Slovakia. At one point, deportations were halted to allow for the repair of the railway line and the expansion of the gas chambers, which doubled their capacity to about 1,200 people. But the Jews would not remain passive witnesses to the slaughter. On October 14th, 1943, the largest attempted escape of prisoners from a Nazi concentration camp in World War II took place. Some 300 camp workers rebelled and killed several SS supervisors and Ukrainian guards. Many inmates died during the rebellion. Those who had managed to escape were mostly captured and killed. All those who remained were executed the next day. The Nazis dismantled the camp and planted trees in the area. After the gates of the devastating extermination center closed, Its gas chambers had killed a total of some 250,000 Jews with carbon monoxide, mostly from Poland, and occupied parts of the Soviet Union. However, Stangl's stay at Sobibor was not until the end. The commander only headed the camp until October 1942, when he emigrated to another destination.
The Jews would be packed on trains through the wastelands of that part of Poland. And they'd arrive at this station in the middle of nowhere. And the station would have flowers and a clock and a timetable. If you're a Jew coming off this tortuous, horrid journey from Warsaw, you think maybe there's some normality returning, maybe things aren't too bad. And there would be Franz Stangl. Behind the station was the scene of utter horror. They were funneled down a tunnel, they were stripped, and then they were gassed, and then they were burnt.
Franz Stangl had been tasked with creating a mirage to continue the journey of death that the victims had been deceived into undertaking. His men informed the new arrivals that they were in a transit camp and that they had to strip and shower to avoid illness. Bewildered and starving, the Jews obeyed the orders to strip off their clothes and belongings. In addition, women had their heads shaved, since human hair was very valuable to the Nazis. The future victims were forced to walk through a narrow wire-enclosed corridor, known as the tube, which did not lead to the showers but to the terrible gas chambers. Later, their bodies were thrown into mass graves and then incinerated. After this successful experience, Stangl took charge of the third extermination camp in occupied Poland, Treblinka, which at that time was overcrowded with prisoners and chaotically administered. There he re-established the already proven system. The commander's new home was located about 80 kilometers northeast of Warsaw, on the main Warsaw-Białystok railway line. There were actually two camps in that region. The first was opened by the Nazis 4 kilometers from the train station in December 1941 as a small forced labor camp. The second, larger and top-secret camp was called Treblinka II and was 1.6 kilometers from the first. That one opened in July 1942, directly to function as an extermination camp in the framework of the Holocaust. Mass deportations from the Polish capital and other nearby areas took place daily, and before long, hundreds of thousands of Jews had already been taken to their deaths in this terrifying place. The procedure was practically the same. Upon arrival at the camp in freight cars, the victims were separated by sex, stripped of their clothes and other possessions, taken to buildings and gassed with carbon monoxide, which came out through the pipes on the roof of the diesel engines. Everything was carried out with complete slowness and coldness.
From the whistle to the smoke, 30 minutes.
So you'd be arriving at the station, and before the hour was gone, you'd be dead.
At the Treblinka extermination camp, Stangl effectively industrialized mass killing at a rate of 3,000 prisoners in 2 hours, with a maximum of 12,000 to 15,000 killed per day. However, there are believed to have been times when as many as 22,000 prisoners were killed in just 24 hours. At this camp, the commander had one of his best apprentices, Gustav Wagner, who was his assistant and subordinate. He was one of the most feared figures in the camp and was nicknamed the Beast. He spread fear among the inmates because he would shoot his victims for no reason. Prisoners described him as a cold-blooded and sadistic person. With collaborators like this, Franz Stangl directly supervised the deaths of at least 1 million people between the two camps in Poland, and for his effectiveness, he was awarded the Iron Cross, First Class. The killing had been so effective that the lack of prisoners led to the closure of Treblinka, After that, the Nazi leader was sent to fight against the partisans in Trieste, Italy. There, together with the remaining personnel of Operation Reinhard and under the command of SS General Odilo Globoknik, Stangl oversaw the killing of captured Jews in the area of San Saba, Rome. Later, he moved to Vienna, where he served in the so-called Alpine Fortress until the end of the war. After the conflict, Stangl was captured by American troops in northern Italy and brought before international military tribunals for his involvement in the euthanasia program. This could have been the end of his ruthless criminal career, but he still had great potential for evil that was destined to sweep the world and continue to add victims. In 1948, he managed to escape from the Gleisenbach prisoner of war camp with the help of the Catholic bishop Alois Hudal and the so-called Odessa Group. This was an organization formed by former members of the SS in 1946 at the end of the war. It functioned as a secret collaboration network developed to help Nazis escape from Germany to other countries where they would be safe, particularly South America. However, in the case of Franz Stangl, he fled first to Syria, where he lived for a few years in Damascus. It was not until 1951 that he was able to cross the planet to a more distant destination in the south of the American continent. This is how he arrived in Brazil, where he settled with his family.
A principios de los 50, la tensión creciente entre Rusia y Estados Unidos implicó que la caza de los criminales de guerra nazis dejara de ser una prioridad para los aliados.
La Guerra Fría ayudó enormemente a los criminales de guerra nazis. Se dieron cuenta de que podían sacar provecho de los desencuentros entre Oriente y Occidente, de que podían escapar o incluso quedarse en Alemania o en Austria sin ser castigados. Y eso dificultó enormemente la tarea a Simon Wiesenthal.
This new character was none other than an Austrian Jew who survived the Holocaust. After escaping from the extermination camps, Wiesenthal became the greatest researcher, persecutor, and person in charge of reporting on the existence and mission of the Odessa. In addition, he dedicated the rest of his life to locating Nazis to bring them to trial, and Franz Stangl was one of his main targets. That task led him to the city of São Paulo, where the former member of the SS worked at the factory of the German company Volkswagen. Although this seems to announce that he had finally decided to change his life and leave cruelty behind, as we told you before, that was never the plan of the bloodthirsty commander of the Hitler regime. During Stangl's stay, Brazil entered into a military dictatorship as a result of a coup d'etat carried out by the country's armed forces. After overthrowing the democratic government of then-President João Goulart in 1964, the new administration found a great ally in a German automotive company to promote the so-called economic miracle that would allow for new growth. The motto of this initiative was order and progress, and Volkswagen became a crucial partner in finding someone who could enforce that message, no matter the means. Although the company would later deny knowing Franz Stangl's Nazi origins, many of the victims who later participated in reports and investigations claim that his past was precisely what gave the former commander his job. The knowledge and experience he acquired in concentration camps in Poland allowed him to work at the German company's plant in San Bernardo do Campo, whose facilities were used as cells where trade unionists were interrogated. These groups represented movements that sought to defend workers' rights and denounce the mistreatment they suffered. Stangl's job was to arrest them and then hand them over to the Directorate of Political and Social Order for imprisonment, torture, and in some cases, elimination. The assembly between the Volkswagen control system and the dictatorship worked for years, with fierce repression in between. Adriano Diogo, a political prisoner in the 1970s, headed the Truth Commission in São Paulo during the presidency of Dilma Rousseff between 2010 and 2016, when the first pieces of industrialized terrorism became known, and there he dedicated a special paragraph to the work of the Nazi. It took 4 years of exhaustive work that allowed us to reveal with documents and testimonies that Franz Stangl had an important role. The organization that he led for 8 years at Volkswagen continued to function for decades. That scheme was a tributary of the dictatorship. And to a certain extent, it can be said that the dictatorship was a tributary of that scheme, Diogo said. In addition, he also confessed that the harmony reached such a point that the company hired Brazilian military personnel, preferably with a command of the German language, to work in the security department created by Stangl. The control was total, with a crude Nazi precision. Beyond this, the former commander had a quiet life in Brazil. He was a simple citizen who worked for a well-known car manufacturer and had a good relationship with his neighbors.
The war criminal is eventually able to move his family into a spacious new home.
And he finally thinks, that's it, I put the old world, all my crimes behind me, I'll be forgotten.
But Wiesenthal has not forgotten. Like other victims of Nazi cruelty, he cannot forget.
In the mid-1960s, his residence on South American soil was discovered by the Jew who had become a Nazi hunter. Simon Wiesenthal notified the West German authorities of this and pressed for Stangl to be tried. Finally, on 28 February 1967, he was arrested by the Brazilian police. And almost 4 months later, on 23rd June, he was extradited to Germany to stand trial for crimes against humanity.
In June 1967, Franz Stangl arrives in Germany to face charges of genocide.
He was an enormous fish for the Germans to bring back.
The Stangl trial was another one of those key moments in Holocaust history, fundamentally, because people hadn't quite realized what had been going on in these camps, and the fact that people like Stangl were still alive, and they had been working anonymous, boring, quiet lives on the other side of the world for so many years.
Franz Stangl was accused of the direct murder of 400,000 Jews from Austria, Bulgaria, Greece, the Netherlands, Poland, Turkey, and Yugoslavia, as well as Gypsies and many other groups. As if that were not enough, he was also accused of having collaborated in the murder of 700,000 people between April 1942 and August 1943. The former commander was found guilty on December 22, 1970, by the Dusseldorf court, which sentenced him to life imprisonment. After being convicted, the Nazi denied his guilt, pointing out that he had been present during all the murders, but only as an accomplice and not as the person responsible for the brutal massacres. "My fault is that I am still here. That is my fault," Stangl said. Beyond his twisted way of understanding the brutal acts in which he had participated, being the main mastermind behind the macabre executions, he spent his last days in prison, where he died of a heart attack on June 28, 1971. Now, after having learned the terrible story of this criminal mind, that not only killed hundreds of thousands of Jews, but also brought his torture mechanisms to Brazil, the time has come to say goodbye. Thank you very much for joining us. We look forward to seeing you in our next installment of Military History.